a young boy selling candy, saved the life of a millionaire's daughter. And what he asked for in return brought the millionaire to tears. Jack leaned against a streetlight, watching the cars whiz by on one of the busiest avenues in Los Angeles. The sun blazed down, and the heat made sweat drip steadily down his face. The small box of candy hanging from his neck swayed with every step he took as he approached the cars, hoping to make a sale. He knew today had to be different. His mum was running out of her medication. As he waited for the light to turn red, Jack glanced up at the sky and let out a deep sigh. "Mum, I promise, I'll make it work," he whispered under his breath, as if she could hear him from where she lay resting at home. The light finally changed, and Jack dashed over to the waiting cars. "Candy, candy for $1. Please help a kid out," he repeated almost robotically, tapping lightly on windows. Some drivers shook their heads, others simply ignored him. At last, a woman rolled down her window and handed him some coins. "Thank you, ma'am. God bless you," Jack said, with a tired smile. The woman looked at him for a moment, her eyes filled with pity. "How old are you, kid?" she asked. "12, ma'am, just 12. She shook her head and appeared to be upset about his situation, but said nothing else. The light turned green, and she drove off. Jack slipped the coin into his pocket and returned to the sidewalk. The constant hum of the cars was like background noise he had long gotten used to. When the traffic finally eased, Jack decided it was time to head home. He walked through the narrow, dusty streets of his neighborhood, passing by modest houses with peeling paint. When he reached his small home, he carefully opened the door. The atmosphere inside the house was dim, with just a few beams of light seeping through the poorly sealed windows. "Mum, I'm back," Jack said as he walked in. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, like he didn't want to disturb her. "Jack, you're home already." His mother's voice was faint, but there was warmth in it. "Yes, Mom. I sold a few candies today, but it wasn't much," he replied. "I'll try to sell more tomorrow," he added, as he moved closer to the bed where she was resting. "Don't worry, son. You're doing everything you can. I just worry about you, out on the streets every day." She tried to smile, but the weariness in her eyes was obvious. Jack sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I'll figure something out, Mom, I promise. We just need a little more time. I'll find a way to get you out of here, to give you a better life." She gently brushed her fingers across Jack's face. "You've always been so brave, my little one. Your father would be so proud of you." "Mum, let's not think about that right now," Jack interrupted softly. "Let's focus on getting you better, okay?" She nodded, closing her eyes for a moment. "You're right. I'll try to rest for a bit. Thank you, Jack, for everything. I'll make us something to eat. It's not much, but it's what we've got," Jack said, standing up and heading to the small kitchen. He began preparing a pot on the stove, all the while thinking about how to make more money. The medicine was getting more expensive, and time seemed to be running out. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, what he made on the streets wasn't going to cut it. He needed a real solution, something that could truly change their situation. As the food simmered, he heard a faint cough coming from the next room. Jack rushed to check on his mother, but she just waved her hand as if to say she was okay. "Rest, Mum. I'll take care of everything," he said with renewed determination. Though deep down, he knew he was running out of options. After a while, Jack returned with a simple plate of food and helped his mother eat. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was a tension in the air, a shared understanding that time wasn't on their side. When his mother was finished, Jack lay down beside her on the small bed. They stayed there together, quietly, simply enjoying each other's presence. The challenges they had faced had strengthened their bond, which was evident even in the absence of words. That night, as sleep finally began to overtake him. Jack whispered, "Tomorrow will be a better day, Mom. I promise." And so, in the quiet of the night, he fell asleep with a sliver of hope that tomorrow might bring a change, a glimmer of light at the end of the seemingly endless tunnel. In LA, Mr. Edward was known as one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city. His business empire controlled a vast network of enterprises, and he lived in an enormous mansion atop a hill, surrounded by lush gardens and discreet security. On the surface, everything about his life seemed perfect, but deep down, he knew something was missing. That morning, Edward sat in his office, a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Papers and contracts lay scattered across his desk, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced at the gold watch on his wrist and sighed, realizing he was running late for yet another important meeting. "Mr. Edward, the driver is waiting," said his assistant as she entered the room. "I'm coming, Tina," he replied without much enthusiasm. He stood up slowly, adjusted his tie, and grabbed the folder with the necessary documents. "Has Emily already left for school?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Tina replied. "The nanny took her earlier. She was asking about you before she left." Edward paused, his gaze drifting. "Of course she was," he muttered to himself. He was aware that he wasn't spending much time with his daughter Emily, an 8-year-old girl who, despite having access to every luxury money could buy, still felt as though something was missing: his presence. "Anything else, sir?" Tina asked, noticing her boss's moment of hesitation. "No, nothing. Just make sure the documents are ready for tomorrow's meeting," he replied. "Oh, and tell Emily I'll be home for dinner tonight," he added, trying to ease his conscience a bit. "Yes, sir," Tina responded, used to promises that weren't always kept. Edward left the office and got into the waiting car. As the vehicle made its way down the hill toward downtown, Emily was all he could think about. There was something in her face that morning that gave him pause. A kind of look filled with anticipation, as if she were waiting for him to say something significant, something important. But as was often the case, he was in too much of a hurry to pick up on it. The car moved swiftly through the busy streets of Los Angeles, and Edward found himself staring out the window, watching the people moving quickly through their day. They crossed streets, darted between cars, and hurried along the sidewalks, typical scenes of the city he oversaw in many ways. Yet recently those scenes felt more distant, more removed from his life than ever before. Edward knew that his life revolved entirely around his business dealings. It was something he was well aware of, something that consumed him, and it pulled him away from the things that truly mattered, the things that had real meaning. He'd known this for a while, but somehow he always found a reason or an excuse not to change. When the car arrived at the office tower in the heart of the business district, Edward stepped out of the vehicle. But just as he was about to walk inside the building, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from Emily, sent through the nanny. "Daddy, today we're going to play together. I miss you." For a moment, Edward stopped in his tracks. He read the message once, then again, as if the words were pulling at something deep within him. "Yes, Emily. Today, we will definitely play together," he typed back, putting the phone in his pocket. But as he entered the office, he couldn't shake the nagging doubt creeping into his mind. Would he actually make time for her? Could he keep his promise? While Edward spent the day buried in meetings, contracts, and numbers, Emily was at school, her thoughts wandering far from her lessons. She sat at her desk, doodling in her notebook. Her drawings always followed a similar theme: large houses with sprawling gardens, big and beautiful. But there was always a small figure tucked into the corner of every picture. It was always her, alone. waiting for something more than all the toys and gifts her father sent. When school ended, Emily returned home with the nanny. As she often did, she went straight to the garden to play, alone. The house was grand, the garden expansive. But to Emily, it all felt empty. She glanced at the clock now and then, counting the minutes until her father would come home. She knew from experience that he often ran late. On many nights, he didn't make it home at all. Emily ran across the lawn, blowing bubbles into the air, watching them float and shimmer in the sunlight. As she did, she kept her eyes on the gate, hoping, as always, to see her father's car driving through. She didn't need much. Just a few minutes with him would have been enough. But that afternoon, something unexpected happened. It was a typical day in Los Angeles, with the chaotic traffic and the scorching sun beating down on the streets. Emily, as always, was playing in the garden under the watchful eye of the nanny, who sat a little distance away. Distracted by her game, Emily drifted further and further from the house, her steps carrying her beyond the familiar lawn. She didn't notice as she passed through the wide-open gates, left ajar by one of the gardeners, and the nanny, absorbed in her phone, failed to see Emily slipping away, her little figure growing smaller as she wandered further from home. Emily, intrigued by the people and cars outside, began wandering down the sidewalk, moving farther away from the safety of home. Her curious eyes took in the bright storefronts and the colorful billboards. The city, with all its hustle and bustle, seemed like a grand adventure for such a young child. Suddenly, a dog dashed across the street, and finding it cute, Emily impulsively decided to chase after it. The animal was fast, weaving through pedestrians, and without recognizing the danger, Emily followed it across the street. She didn't notice the speeding car coming her way. The driver slammed on the brakes, but the car was moving too fast. The screech of the tires filled the air, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. It was at that moment that Jack, returning home after another day of selling candy, saw what was happening. Without a second thought, he ran toward Emily, tossing his box of candies aside. In one swift motion, he grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back onto the sidewalk just as the car whizzed by, barely missing them. The stunned silence of the bystanders, who had been watching the scene with wide eyes, followed the screeching tires on the pavement. Emily, still shaking with fear, looked up at Jack, her eyes brimming with tears. You saved me," she said in a trembling voice. Jack, still catching his breath, replied, "Are you okay? You didn't get hurt, did you?" Emily shook her head, trying to hold back her tears. "No, I'm fine. Just scared. Thank you. Thank you so much." People began gathering around them, whispering about what had just happened. An older woman approached and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "That was brave, young man. You saved this girl's life." Jack just nodded, still trying to process everything. He looked over at Emily, who seemed lost and confused. "Do you know where you live? Are you by yourself?" Before Emily could respond, her nanny, pale and frantic, came rushing over, pushing through the crowd. "Emily, thank God you're safe." She kneeled down beside the little girl, hugging her tightly. Emily was still visibly shaken, her hands trembling slightly, as she looked at Jack. "How did you manage to get out of that situation?" she asked, her voice still carrying traces of fear, but laced with relief. She couldn't believe she was standing there, safe, after what had just happened. This boy saved me, Mary," she said, her gaze shifting to the nanny. "He pulled me out of the street, right onto the sidewalk." The nanny, realizing the gravity of the situation, turned to look at Jack. Her eyes softened with gratitude as she stepped toward him. "Thank you, young man," she said sincerely, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to begin to thank you. You were like an angel watching over her." Jack, modest as ever, gave a small shake of his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "I only did what anyone should do," he replied quietly. "She was in danger. I just reacted." Before they could continue, the sudden screech of tires interrupted them. The loud sound cut through the air as a sleek, luxury car pulled up hastily to the curb. The door swung open and out stepped Mr. Edward, his face pale with concern. He moved quickly toward Emily, his eyes never leaving her. "Emily, my daughter," he exclaimed as he knelt beside her, wrapping her in a tight embrace. His arms encircled her protectively, and he held her close, as if afraid to let go. "Dad!" Emily cried out, finally feeling a sense of security wash over her. She clung to her father, her voice trembling as she added, "I was so scared, Dad. I didn't know what was going to happen." Mr. Edward pulled back just enough to look at her, his face full of relief. "You're safe now. You're safe," he murmured, holding her a little tighter, as though reassuring himself. Then his gaze shifted, and for the first time, he noticed Jack standing nearby. "You?" he asked, his voice soft with disbelief. "You're the one who saved my daughter?" His tone carried a mix of awe and gratitude. Jack nodded shyly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Yes, sir. She was crossing the street, and I pulled her to the sidewalk before anything could happen." Mr. Edwards stared at the boy for a moment, his expression shifting to one of profound gratitude. "I don't have words for this, for what you did. You saved the most important person in my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Without a second thought, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick wad of bills. Extending the money toward Jack, he said, "Please take this. It's the least I can do for you." Jack's eyes fell on the money, but he quickly shook his head. "I can't accept that, sir," he replied. "I just did what anyone should do in that situation." Mr. Edward looked surprised, momentarily stunned by Jack's refusal. "But this is a lot of money. It could make a big difference in your life," he insisted, pushing the bills forward again. Jack offered a faint smile. "Money isn't everything, sir," he said quietly. "I just wanted to help her." Mr. Edward stood there, speechless for a few moments, taking in Jack's words. Something about the boy intrigued him. He wasn't like anyone Mr. Edward had encountered before, so modest, so selfless. The businessman's curiosity deepened. "So, what do you want, son?" Mr. Edward asked, his voice now filled with genuine interest. "How can I repay you for what you did for my daughter?" Jack glanced at Emily, then back at Mr. Edward. His voice was soft but firm as he answered, "I just wanted you to come with me. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Mr. Edward, still intrigued by Jack's unusual request, agreed to join him. "All right, kid. Let's see what's so important to you," he said, trying to mask the curiosity growing inside him. Emily, gripping her father's hand tightly, insisted on coming along as well. The nanny hesitated, but a quick gesture from Mr. Edward reassured her that there was no need to worry. The three of them followed Jack through the streets of Los Angeles. The contrast between Edward's luxurious car and the modest path they were walking on was obvious. As they left the busier parts of town and entered a more run-down neighborhood, the air seemed to grow heavy with an unspoken sense of despair. After walking silently for several minutes, Jack finally stopped in front of a small house with peeling walls and a roof that had seen better days. "This is it," he said, pushing open the creaky door. The yard, if you could call it that, was overrun with weeds, and an old rusted bike leaned against the wall. Mr. Edward glanced around, feeling discomfort he wasn't used to. He had always been aware of the poverty in the city, but standing right in front of it made it feel much more real. Emily, on the other hand, looked confused, clutching her father's hand even tighter. Jack led them to the door and stepped inside first. "Mama, I'm back," he said, softly, though his tone carried a sense of urgency. Edward and Emily hesitated at the door, unsure of what to do, until Jack called out to them, "Please, come in. I want you to meet my mother." The house was simple, with old furniture and barely any decorations. In one corner of the room, there was a makeshift bed where a frail-looking woman lay. Her pale, tired face clearly showed the toll of a long battle with illness. "Jack, you brought guests?" the woman asked as she lifted herself slightly to get a better look. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Yes, Mama. This is Mr. Edward and his daughter Emily. They wanted to meet you," Jack replied, offering a shy smile. Mr. Edward stepped forward, feeling a lump form in his throat. He reached out his hand toward the woman, who looked at him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Nice to meet you, ma'am. I'm Edward," he said, without the usual formal tone he used when introducing himself. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. "I'm not sure what my son may have told you, but I hope he didn't make you uncomfortable," the woman added with a faint smile, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "Actually, I was quite impressed," Edward responded sincerely. "Your son is remarkable." Emily, who had been quiet up until then, walked over to the bed and smiled at the woman. "Are you Jack's mom? He saved me today. He's a hero," she said, with the innocence of a child who sees things in a pure and straightforward way. Jack's mother smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride and emotion. "Yes, Emily. He's always been my hero, ever since the day he was born." That comment hit Edward like a weight in his chest. Watching this moment unfold, he realized how much he had distanced himself from his own daughter, believing that expensive gifts and a life of luxury could replace what truly mattered. That small house, so different from his own, seemed to hold more warmth than his mansion ever had. Sensing Edward's silence, Jack spoke in a softer tone. "Sir, I just wanted you to see how we live. My mom has been sick for a long time, and I do what I can to take care of her." Edward remained silent for a long moment, looking at Jack and then his mother. The simplicity and honesty of this moment struck him deeply. He understood that being a hero wasn't the issue. It was about more than just finances. It was proof that even in the midst of extreme poverty, the love and care between a mother and her son were unbreakable. Edward found himself at a crossroads. He could either continue living in his isolated world of wealth or allow this experience to change him. "Jack, your mother's very lucky to have a son like you," Edward said at last. "I'm going to help, not just with money. I want to make sure your mum gets the treatment she needs and that you have a chance to go to school to build a future far away from the streets." Jack's eyes filled with tears, but he kept himself composed, nodding. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to repay you." Edward crouched down beside Jack, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to repay me, Jack. Sometimes it takes someone like you to remind us of what truly matters." And with a smile, she looked at the scene unfolding before her. Taking Jack's hand, she said, "You're my friend now, Jack. We can play together when my nanny isn't paying attention." Laughter broke out, easing the tension in the air. That moment marked the beginning of a profound change in the lives of Edward and his family. With Jack's mother receiving the care she needed and his new routine in school taking shape, the boy's world began to shift in ways he never expected. In the mornings, there was no longer a need to run toward the traffic lights, selling candies to make ends meet. Now, he would put on his school uniform, pack his backpack, and head to class with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Jack felt, for the first time, like he had a real chance at a future when he was around kids from various backgrounds. At school, he quickly stood out for his drive and curiosity. Every lesson was soaked up eagerly. For Jack, learning wasn't just about keeping up with the coursework. It was an open door to a world he'd only ever dreamed of. His teachers soon noticed the spark in his eyes and the dedication he poured into each task. A boy who once focused solely on surviving, Jack was now starting to dream of what he could become. During recess, Emily was always close by. She introduced him to new friends, and before long Jack felt part of the group. They played, talked, and sometimes Emily insisted on helping him with his homework. "You're going to be the top student here, Jack," she said confidently, and Jack would just smile, grateful for the friendship blossoming between them. One afternoon after school, Emily invited Jack to her house. He hesitated at first, aware of the difference between their lives, but eventually agreed. Jack was astounded by the mansion's sheer grandeur when they arrived at her house. Everything there seemed designed to showcase Mr. Edward's wealth and success. However, what stood out the most to Jack was the way Emily spoke about the house. "It's nice, isn't it?" she said as they walked through the wide halls. "But sometimes it feels really big and empty." Jack looked at her in surprise. "Empty? How could that be? You have everything here." Emily shrugged her shoulders. "I have everything I could ever want, but it wasn't always that way with my dad. Now, he's making an effort to be around more, and I appreciate that. But before, I used to feel so alone, even with all these rooms and beautiful things surrounding me. They didn't fill the emptiness I felt inside." Emily's words lingered in Jack's mind. He understood what it meant to miss someone deeply, although his situation was different. Even through their hardest times, Jack had always had the steady, loving presence of his mother. She never left his side, no matter what challenges they faced. It was a reminder that no amount of material wealth could ever replace true emotional connections. As they continued talking, Mr. Edward walked into the room. He paused briefly when he saw them sitting together, and a warm smile spread across his face. "I see you two are getting along quite well," he remarked, as he made his way to a chair and sat down beside them. "Yeah, Dad. Jack is my best friend now," Emily said, her voice filled with pride. Edward turned to Jack with a look of curiosity and care. "So, Jack, how are things going? How's school treating you?" he asked. Jack smiled, feeling a bit shy, but speaking from the heart. "I'm doing well, sir. The classes are challenging, but I'm enjoying them. It's an opportunity I never thought I'd have," he responded with sincerity. Edward nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious but warm. "I'm really happy to hear that," he said. "You deserve every chance you're getting, Jack. And remember, if you ever need anything, I'm always here to help." As the days passed, Jack settled into a routine. He made sure to visit his mother in the hospital whenever he could, and each time he saw her, his heart filled with relief. She was steadily getting stronger, her smile brighter with each visit. That smile became a constant reminder that things were finally improving after so much hardship. One afternoon, after a long day at school, Jack made his way to the hospital as usual. To his surprise, when he arrived, he saw Mr. Edward already there, sitting at his mother's bedside. They were talking in a relaxed, easy manner, like old friends catching up after years apart. When Jack entered the room, Edward noticed him and motioned for him to come closer. "I was just telling your mother how well you're doing in school," Edward said, smiling warmly at him. Jack sat down beside his mother and smiled at her. "Yeah, Mom. I've been learning a lot, and I've even started thinking about what I want to do when I grow up," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with hope. His mother's eyes softened as she turned to him. Her voice, though still weak, was full of curiosity. "And what would that be, my son?" Jack paused for a moment, looking at both his mother and Mr. Edward, feeling the importance of the question. "I want to be someone who helps others, someone who makes a real difference, like you did for us, Mr. Edward," he finally answered, his words filled with emotion. Edward smiled, deeply moved by Jack's words. "You're already making a difference, Jack. Sometimes it's not about money or power, but about how we touch the lives of others. You've shown me that more than anyone." Jack's mother beamed with pride for her son. "Jack has always been special. I know you'll reach all your dreams," she said. As the weeks went by, Jack's life kept improving. His mother grew stronger and could now stand and walk around her hospital room. The doctors were hopeful about her recovery, and each day brought more optimism that she would soon return home. Meanwhile, Jack was excelling at school. His teachers often praised his hard work and dedication, and his peers began to see him as someone who faced challenges with an inspiring sense of courage. Emily, always by his side, helped him with his schoolwork and encouraged him to join extracurricular activities. Together, they formed a friendship that surpassed the differences in their backgrounds. One morning, as Jack was getting ready for school, he received some exciting news. His mother was finally ready to leave the hospital. It was the moment he had been waiting for so long. When he arrived at the hospital to pick her up, he found Edward already there, helping with the final preparations for her discharge. "Jack, today is a big day," Edward said with a warm smile. "Your mum is much better now, and that's partly because of you." Jack's eyes sparkled with joy as he gently hugged his mum. "I'm so happy you're feeling better, Mum. Let's go home and make things just like they used to be." With tears in her eyes, his mother stroked his face. "My son, nothing will be like it was before. It will be better. We've been through so much, and now we have a new chance, a new life." Edward quietly watched the scene, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment as he witnessed their happiness. For him, this journey had been a transformation as well. Everything he had done for Jack and his mother wasn't just an act of kindness, but a way to reconnect with his own humanity. That same day, they returned to Jack's home, but things were different this time. Edward had made a few improvements to the house, making it more comfortable and better suited for Jack's mother's recovery. When Jack entered, he was surprised by the changes. The roof had been fixed, the walls were freshly painted, and there was even new furniture. "Mom, look," Jack exclaimed, amazed. "Everything looks so beautiful." His mother smiled, still a little emotional. "It's truly unbelievable. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Edward." Standing next to them, Edward shook his head. "There's no need to thank me. I did what was right, and you both deserve all of this, and more. What matters now is that you're happy and doing well." In the days that followed, Mr. Edward kept visiting Jack's family regularly. He felt like he had become a part of their lives in a way he never expected. Whenever he could, he brought Emily along, who loved spending time with Jack. The two of them would play in the yard, laughing and sharing stories. For Emily, being with Jack was a new and enriching experience, a friendship that wasn't based on wealth or status. One afternoon, while Jack and Emily were tossing a ball in the yard, Mr. Edward and Jack's mother sat at a distance, watching from the shade of a tree. "You know, Edward," Jack's mother said, "I never imagined life would bring us here. Just a few months ago, I thought everything was lost, and now, seeing my son so happy, it's like a dream." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Life has a funny way of surprising us. Sometimes, what we think is the end is really just the start of something much bigger." She looked at Edward, her eyes filled with gratitude. You've changed our lives, Edward, and I can see that your life has changed too. I'm not the only one who says this, but thank you. Truly." Edward smiled, a genuine smile, something he rarely did before meeting Jack. "I think we've all learned something from this experience. I probably learned the most. You've shown me what really matters in life, and for that, I'm the one who should be thanking you." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the yard, Edward felt an inner peace he hadn't known in a long time. He found himself in a modest place, surrounded by people who, not too long ago, were complete strangers. But now, they were something more. They had become living proof that life's true worth isn't found in what we own, but in the bonds we form and the people we impact along the way. Emily ran over, out of breath from playing. "Dad, you've got to see how good Jack is at soccer. He's going to be a star. I just know it." Edward chuckled, glancing at Jack. "Well, if that's the path you want to take, I'll be here to cheer you on." Jack smiled, still shy about the praise, but clearly happy. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what I'll do with my future yet, but right now, I feel like I could be anything." "And you can," Edward replied confidently. "With hard work and heart, you can achieve whatever you set your mind to." That night, after everyone said their goodbyes and Edward and Emily headed home, he lay in bed feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Despite the challenges he had faced in his life, he knew he had finally found a greater purpose. He was excited for the future, a future where he wasn't alone, but connected to something bigger than himself. More than anything, he was determined to be the father and man he had always aspired to be. As he drifted off to sleep, one last image came to mind. Jack's smile and the certainty that he had made the right choice, not just for the boy's life, but for his own as well. In the days that followed, Jack and his mother settled into the calm rhythm of their neighborhood. The house, now refreshed, stood as a symbol of the changes in their lives. Jack continued attending school, throwing himself into his studies with a newfound determination. Meanwhile, his mother, still on the mend, slowly returned to taking care of small tasks around the house and began looking toward the future with hope. As for Edward, he felt more and more connected to Jack and his mother. His visits to their home became more frequent, and he found that he enjoyed spending time in the warm and simple environment. For him, those visits were like a breath of fresh air, a much-needed break from the whirlwind of commitments that came with his life as a businessman. One afternoon, after school, Jack sat on the porch reading one of the books he had borrowed from the school library. The sun was bright, but a gentle breeze made the weather pleasant. His mother was in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. As they heard the sound of a car approaching, it was Mr. Edward, and Emily was with him. "Jack, look what we brought you," Emily shouted, running toward the boy with a bright smile. She held up a shiny, colorful, new soccer ball, something Jack had never owned before. Jack quickly stood up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Is this for me?" Mr. Edward walked over, smiling. "Yes, Jack. Emily told me you're a great player, so I thought a new ball would be a good idea. What do you think?" Jack carefully held the ball, as if it were the most valuable thing he'd ever touched. "This is amazing. Thank you, Mr. Edward. I've never had such a nice ball." Full of energy, Emily was already ready to play. "Come on, Jack, I want to see what you can do." The three of them headed to a small field next to the house, where they began playing. Emily's laughter and Jack's quick movements turned the afternoon into a moment of pure joy. Even Mr. Edward, who rarely got involved in physical activities, joined in, feeling lighter and more relaxed than he had in years. They ran, kicked the ball, fell, and laughed together like a real family. After a while, tired but happy, They sat down on the grass, panting but with smiles on their faces. Always curious, Emily looked at her father and asked, "Dad, did you play soccer when you were a kid?" Edward laughed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I played a little, Emily, but when I started working at a young age, I had to give those things up. Time was short, and there were a lot of responsibilities." Jack, still holding the ball, looked at Edward and asked, "And did you enjoy it? It looked like you were having a lot of fun today." Edward smiled, looking at the two of them. "Yes, I liked it. I think, for a moment, I forgot how good it feels to just have fun without worrying about problems or work. You two reminded me of that today." Emily snuggled up next to her father, pleased to see him so at ease. "I love when we're like this, Dad. Just us, no rush, no obligations." Edward looked at his daughter fondly, feeling a twinge of guilt for taking so long to realize how important these moments were. "Emily, I feel the same, and I promise we'll have many more days like this." Jack, still amazed by everything that was happening, felt a warmth spreading in his chest. He never imagined that his life would change so much in such a short time. "Mr. Edward, I don't know how to thank you for all you've done for me and my mom," Jack said, his voice filled with gratitude. Edward smiled and shook his head. "No need to thank me, Jack. Believe me, I've learned just as much from you, and seeing you happy and your mother getting better is the best reward I could ever get." As the afternoon stretched on, the sky gradually shifted to hues of orange and pink. They headed back to the house, where Jack's mother had already finished making dinner. They sat down together, enjoying a simple meal, but one full of meaning. For Mr. Edward, this moment was far more valuable than any fancy dinner at an upscale restaurant. He was surrounded by people who had quickly become an important part of his life. As they ate, they chatted about plans for the future. Emily excitedly talked about school and her activities, while Jack shared his latest discoveries in his studies. Mr. Edward listened intently, engaging with them and becoming part of their warm, heartfelt conversation. After dinner, before saying goodbye, Jack's mother pulled Mr. Edward aside. "Edward, I know I've said this many times, but you've really changed our lives. And I'm not just talking about the material improvements. Your presence, your kindness, it's something I will never forget." Edward held her hands and looked at her sincerely. "You all have changed my life, too. And I will always be here for you, as a friend and part of this family." She smiled, deeply touched. "We are so lucky to have you in our lives, Edward. Thank you, truly." After their goodbyes, Edward and Emily headed back home, but this time the journey felt different. It wasn't just a return to the mansion, it was a return to a home that was now filled with more love and understanding. Edward felt he had finally found balance between his work and personal life. He had rediscovered the value of small moments and the importance of human connections. That night, as he lay down to sleep, Edward reflected on everything that had happened since the day Jack had entered his life. He closed his eyes, a smile spreading across his face. He knew that no matter what the future held, he was on the right path. As sleep overtook him, he felt certain that the best was still to come. As the days went by, life settled into a rhythm that felt natural and comfortable. Jack continued to excel at school, growing more confident in his abilities with each passing day. Emily was always by his side. She cheered him on with every new achievement, and the two became inseparable. Their friendship was a constant source of happiness and mutual support. Meanwhile, Mr. Edward found himself increasingly involved, not just in business, but also in cherished moments with his daughter and Jack's family. One afternoon after school, Jack and Emily decided to do something different. "Hey Jack, what do you think about showing my dad that park you told me about? The one you used to visit when you had some free time," Emily suggested excitedly. Jack smiled, thinking back to the small park in his old neighborhood. "Sure, Emily. It's not as nice as the parks you're used to, but there's an old swing set that I used to love," he said. Bursting with energy, Emily ran to her dad, who was chatting with Jack's mom on the porch. Dad, can we go to the park Jack used to visit? He says there's an amazing swing there." Mr. Edward, always willing to join in Emily's plans, smiled at her excitement. "Of course, Emily. Let's check out the park that Jack loves so much." They quickly got ready, and soon they were in the car, heading toward Jack's old neighborhood. The drive was familiar to Jack, but for Edward and Emily, it was a new experience. The streets were simple, the houses modest, and the contrast with their previous life was clear. When they arrived at the park, Jack smiled, seeing that not much had changed. The large trees still provided shade, and the swing set he loved was still there, though a little rusty with age. The park was small, but for Jack, it had always been a sanctuary. "This is the swing, Emily," Jack said, pointing to the worn-out swing set. "I used to spend hours here, just swinging and staring up at the sky. It was my favorite place to think." Emily ran to the swing and sat down, gently pushing herself back and forth. "It's amazing, Jack. I've never been on a swing like this before," Emily said, her eyes wide with excitement. "I mean, we have those fancy swings at home, but this one feels special in a different way." From a distance, Mr. Edward watched with a warm smile as the two of them enjoyed themselves. He walked over to Jack, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Thanks for bringing us here, Jack. It's good to be reminded that the simplest places can carry the deepest meanings." Jack looked up at Edward and grinned. "Thank you, sir. This place reminds me of who I am and where I come from, no matter how much my life is changing. It's comforting to know I still have that connection to my past." Edward nodded, understanding perfectly. "Never forget where you come from, Jack. It'll guide you no matter how far you go." As they chatted, Emily called out to her father. "Dad, can you push me on the swing, please?" Edward laughed and walked over to her, giving the swing a gentle push. Emily's laughter echoed through the park, filling the air with an infectious joy. Jack, watching the scene unfold, felt like he was part of something much bigger than himself. He didn't know how fate had brought him to meet Mr. Edward and Emily, but now, being with them, he felt a sense of completeness he never knew he needed. After some time at the park, they decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood. Jack showed them the places he used to visit, the streets he walked, and the small stores where he'd buy whatever little food he could afford. For Edward, the walk was a humbling experience. He saw how Jack's life had been full of challenges, yet also filled with resilience. Every street corner, every story Jack told, was a testament to his strength and determination. By the time they got back home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emily was worn out but content. "Today was one of the best days ever, Dad. Thanks for coming with us." Edward smiled and kissed his daughter on the forehead. "The pleasure was all mine, Emily. Every day we spend together is special." Standing next to them, Jack also felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I never thought my life would change like this, and it's not just because of material things. It's because of you two." Jack's mother, who'd been resting at home, greeted them with a smile as they walked in. She noticed the happiness on her son's face, as well as on Edward's and Emily's. "Looks like you all had quite the adventure today," she said warmly. "Stand up," Jack said, wrapping his arms around her, and it was a beautiful moment. That evening, as everyone was getting ready for bed, Edward found himself reflecting on the day. He realized that sometimes the biggest lessons come from the simplest places. Being in that park, hearing Jack's stories, and witnessing Emily's joy made him understand that life is about small moments and genuine connections. He was determined to carry this new perspective with him, moving forward. Before heading to bed, Edward gazed out the window of his room, staring at the starry sky. He knew there was still much to do, both in his personal life and in his work. But now he had something he hadn't had before, a deep understanding of what truly mattered. And that understanding would guide him, no matter what the future held. With that thought in mind, he closed his eyes, eager for what the next day would bring. For him, for Emily, for Jack, and for everyone he now saw as part of his family. In the days that followed, life for Jack, his mother, and Edward settled into a new rhythm of closeness and friendship. Edward and Emily's visits to Jack's house became a natural part of their lives. The small home, once filled with the silence of daily struggles, was now alive with laughter, conversations, and true companionship. One Saturday morning, Edward had an idea. He was in the kitchen sipping coffee when Emily came in, her usual excitement radiating from her. "Dad, what are we doing today? Can we go to the park again?" Edward smiled, but he had something different in mind. "I was thinking of something special today, Emily. I want to invite Jack and his mother to spend the day at our house. It's been a while since we've all gathered there, and it would be a great chance to spend more time together." Emily loved the idea. "Yes! We can show them the garden, play with the dogs, and even have a picnic." Edward picked up the phone and called Jack's house because the idea excited him. "Good morning, Jack. How about you and your mom come spend the day with us here at home? Emily and I would love to have you over." The invitation caught Jack off guard, but he was thrilled. Jack glanced over at his mother, who was busy at the stove preparing breakfast. He smiled, trying to contain his excitement. "Mum, the gentleman invited us to spend the whole day at his house. What do you think?" His mother paused for a moment, turning to him with a warm smile, clearly delighted by the idea. "That sounds wonderful, Jack. Let's accept the invitation. It'll be a great day," she said, her eyes shining with anticipation. Shortly after, Edward and Emily arrived at their home to pick them up for the outing. Emily, who appeared to be ecstatic, welcomed Jack and his mother with open arms as soon as they arrived at the mansion. "I have so much planned for today. First, I'll show you the garden, and after that, we can play with the dogs," she announced eagerly. They followed Emily as she led them through the vast, beautiful garden of the mansion. It was filled with colorful flowers, towering trees, and neat stone paths that twisted and turned through the landscape. For Jack, it was like discovering a whole new world. He had never seen such a breathtaking garden, so beautifully maintained. Each step revealed new wonders. As they walked, Emily enthusiastically pointed out various features. "These flowers are here. They're my mum's favorites. My dad makes sure they're always taken care of." Jack listened intently as she explained the story behind every corner of the garden. Not far behind, Mr. Edward walked along, quietly watching the group, his heart filled with pride and contentment. He loved seeing everyone enjoying themselves in the world he had worked so hard to create. To Edward, this was the real meaning of his life, sharing these special moments with people who mattered to him. After they had strolled through most of the garden, Emily brought them to a wide-open space where two dogs were playing. "These are Max and Luna," Emily said, gesturing toward the dogs. "They love to run around and fetch balls. Do you want to play with them?" she asked, smiling at Jack. Without hesitation, Jack, who had always adored animals, eagerly agreed. Soon, he and Emily were joyfully throwing balls for Max and Luna to chase. The dogs bounded happily across the wide lawn, their tails wagging furiously as they fetched the balls and brought them back. Jack's mother stood at a distance. Her heart warmed as she watched her son laughing and fitting in so well in this beautiful new environment. His happiness brought her immense joy. After some time spent playing with the dogs, Mr. Edward suggested they take a break and have a picnic. Together they prepared everything, spreading out a large blanket in the middle of the garden. They laid out a simple yet delicious spread of food, fresh fruits, sandwiches, and drinks. As they sat on the blanket, beneath the soft glow of the morning sun, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about life, shared their dreams, and discussed their thoughts about the future. At one point, during a brief lull in the conversation, Mr. Edward turned to Jack with a thoughtful expression. "So, Jack," he began, "have you thought about what you might want to do once you finish school? I know there's still time, but it's never too early to dream." Jack took a moment to consider the question, looking out thoughtfully across the garden. "I've been thinking about it a lot, sir," he admitted. "I want to help people, maybe the way you do, but I also love learning. I think maybe I could become a teacher or a doctor. I want to do something that will let me make a difference in people's lives, just like my life has been changed." Jack's thoughtful response clearly impressed Mr. Edward, who nodded slowly. "You can be anything you want, Jack," he said, with a kind smile, full of encouragement. "And with your determination, I know you'll achieve anything you set your mind to." As always, full of energy, Emily jumped into the conversation. "I want to be an artist, Dad. I'm going to paint beautiful pictures, like the ones we have at home." Edward laughed, pulling Emily close. "I'm sure you'll be an amazing artist, my dear." The afternoon carried on with more games and laughter. By the end of the day, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of gold, they gathered again on the mansion's terrace, enjoying the pleasant weather. Jack's mother, seated next to Edward, let out a deep sigh, taking in the moment. "Edward, today was unforgettable for us. I never thought we could experience something like this. Thank you, truly." Edward looked at her warmly. "The pleasure is all mine. It's important to me that you feel at home here because you're a part of our lives now." Hearing those words, Jack was overwhelmed with gratitude. He knew his life had changed in ways he could have never imagined, and it was all thanks to that unlikely encounter. "Mr. Edward, Emily, thank you for everything. You have no idea how much this means to us." Without hesitation, Emily ran to Jack and hugged him. "We're a team now, Jack, always together." When it was finally time to say goodbye, Edward and Emily walked Jack and his mother to the car. "I hope we can do this more often," said Edward. "Our home is always open to you." On the drive back home that night, Jack and his mother talked about the day. "Mom, it felt like a dream, didn't it?" "Yes, my son. And the most incredible part is, we now live in a reality where those dreams can become a part of our everyday life." As they fell asleep, Jack felt a deep sense of peace. Even though life would still present challenges, he was aware that he was now in the company of people who loved him and would be there for him no matter what. Most of all, he knew that no matter what, the new family they had built together was the greatest gift he could have ever received. That night, as Edward lay down to sleep, he reflected on how much his life had changed since the day he met Jack. He had rediscovered joy in the small things, the value of human connections, and the importance of being present for the people he loved. And that, more than any financial success, was what truly made him feel fulfilled. With those thoughts in mind, he drifted off to sleep, confident that the future would bring even more unforgettable moments built with care, dedication, and above all, love. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will touch your heart too. Click to keep watching.